Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more notable names in Native American history. Um, Today we are looking at none other than Geronimo. Big name in Native American history. Someone I think most Americans can name. But yeah, let's take a look at who Geronimo was. He was a Bedunkoe leecher. Sorry, he was a Bedunkoe Apache leader of the Chiricahua Apache who led his people's defense of their homeland against the U.S. military in the United States. Was born 1829 and died in 1909. Um, but yeah, he continued the tradition of the Apaches resisting white colonization into their homeland in the Southwest, participating in raids on Sonora and Chihuahua in Mexico. After years of war, he finally surrendered to troops in 1886. While it brought him a level of celebrity, he spent the last 2 decades of his life as a prisoner of war. Um, so, remember, these are the years America's expanding. The Apache territory, Utah, Arizona, that area of the nation. But yeah. Um, the Apache leader Geronimo was born on June 1829 in No-Doyohn Canyon in Mexico. He was a naturally gifted hunter who, the story goes, as a boy swallowed the heart of his first kill to ensure a lifetime of success on the chase. And being on the run certainly defined his way of life, being that he belonged with the smallest band of the Chiricahua tribe, the Bedunkoe. They numbered a little more than 8,000, and the Apaches were surrounded by enemies, not just Mexicans, but also other tribes, including the Navajo and the Comanches. Raiding their neighbors was also part of the Apache life, and in response, the Mexican government put a bounty on Apache scalps, offering as much as $25 for a child's scalp. But this did little to deter Geronimo and his people, that by the age of 17, he had already led 4 successful raiding operations. So, yeah. Geronimo would fall in love with a woman named Apache, and they would have 3 children together. While he was out on a trading trip, the Mexican soldiers attacked his camp, and word of the ransacking soon reached the Apache men. Excuse me. Quietly that night, Geronimo returned home and found his mother, wife, and 3 children all dead. So for him, it became much more than just pushing back against the encroachment of Mexicans or Americans. It became a personal vendetta. His mother, his wife, his 3 children. You can see where a lot of disdain and hate and anger comes from. The murders devastated Geronimo, and in the tradition of the Apache, he set fire to his family's belongings, and then, in a show of grief, headed to the wilderness to bereave the deaths. There, it is said, alone and crying, a voice came to Geronimo that promised him, "No gun will ever kill you. I will take the bullets from the gun of the Mexicans. I will guide your arrows." Backed by this sudden knowledge of power, he rounds up a force of 200 men and hunted down the Mexican soldiers who killed his family. It went on like this for 10 years as Geronimo exacted revenge against the Mexican government. Beginning in the 1850s, the face of his enemy changed. That's because America and Mexico had fought the Mexican-American War. This is a war in which we gained Texas, California, and a lot of the land in between. Really expanding the U.S. from coast to coast. Yeah. But in those lands, Apache territory was. So, yeah. But, spurred by the discovery of gold in the Southwest, settlers and miners streamed into the lands, and tensions mounted, and the Apache stepped up their attacks, which included brutal ambushes of stagecoaches and wagon trains. The Chiricahua leader at the time, Geronimo's father-in-law, Cochise, could see where the future was headed. In an act that greatly disappointed his son-in-law, the revered chief called a halt to the decade-long war with the Americans and agreed to the establishment of a reservation for his people on a prized piece of Apache property. But within a few years, Cochise died. The federal government reneged on its agreement and moving the Chiricahua north so that the settlers could move on to their former lands. This act only further incensed Geronimo, setting off a new round of fighting. So, yeah. They were defending their lands first against the Mexicans and other tribes, and then the Americans took the place of the Mexicans. But Geronimo would lose his mother, his wife, and his 3 children to a raid, and then his own father-in-law tells him he says, look, we're stopping this war. There should be no more fighting. And now, when he dies, his father-in-law dies, they move the Apache peoples northward so they can take their former lands. It's just wrong. Geronimo would prove to be as elusive as he is aggressive, but authorities would catch up to him in 1877 and send him to San Carlos Apache Reservation. For 4 long years, he struggled with his new reservation life, eventually escaping in September 1881 and out once again with a small band of Chiricahua followers would elude American troops and spend the next 5 years engaged in what proved to be the last of the Indian Wars against the U.S. So remember, that's 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. Perceptions of Geronimo were highly complex. His followers viewed him as the last great defender of the Native American way of life, but others, including fellow Apaches, saw him as a stubborn holdout, violently driven by revenge and foolishly putting the lives of people in danger. With his followers in tow, they would go across the Southwest, performing raids and attacks. And as he did, the seemingly mystical leader was transformed into a legend as newspapers closely followed the Army's pursuit of him. At one point, using up nearly a quarter of the Army's forces, 5,000 troops trying to hunt him down. And remember, at that point in time, Army was much smaller. We didn't have this giant global behemoth. Finally, in the summer of 1886, he would surrender, the last Chiricahua to do so. And over the next several years, he and his people were moved about, first to a prison in Florida, then a prison camp in Alabama, and then to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. In total, he spent 27 years they all spent 27 years as prisoners of war. Geronimo and the rest of the Chiricahua remained under guard, but Geronimo would experience a bit of celebrity from his white former enemies. Less than a decade after he surrendered, crowds longed to catch a glimpse of the famous native warrior, and in 1905 he published his autobiography, and that same year received a private audience with President Teddy Roosevelt, unsuccessfully pressing the American leader to let his people return to Arizona. He would pass away 4 years later while riding home in February of 1909. He would be thrown from his horse. He survived the night out in the cold, but when a friend found him the next day, his health was rapidly deteriorating and would pass away 6 days later. His nephew at his side. And he says, "I should never have surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man alive." Because remember, almost 30 years, the last 3 decades of his life was spent as a prisoner. Wow. Let's look at Britannica's entry. Born June 1829, No-Doyohn Canyon, Mexico. A lot of the same information. What at first was an attempt at to repulse the Mexicans who were coming in and attacking their people after a raid. Yeah, it went badly. In 1874, some 4,000 Apaches were forcibly moved by U.S. authorities to a reservation at San Carlos, a barren wasteland in east central Arizona. Deprived of traditional tribal rights, short on rations, and homesick, they turned to Geronimo and others who led them in the depredations that plunged the region into turmoil and bloodshed. In the early 1870s, Lieutenant Colonel George F. Crook, commander of the Department of Arizona, had succeeded in establishing relative peace in the territory. The management of his successors, however, was disastrous, and spurred by Geronimo, hundreds of Apaches left the reservation to resume their war against the whites. In 1882, Crook was recalled to Arizona to conduct a campaign against the natives, and Geronimo would surrender in January 1884, only to leave from the San Carlos Reservation in May 1885, accompanied by 35 men, 8 boys, and 101 women. Crook threw his best men into the campaign, and it would be 10 months later, on March 27, 1886, Geronimo would surrender at Cañón de los Embudos in Sonora. Near the border, however, fearing that they would be murdered once they crossed into U.S. territory, Geronimo and a small band bolted. As a result, Brigadier General Nelson A. Miles replaced Crook as commander on April the 2nd. During this last campaign, no fewer than 5,000 white soldiers and 500 native auxiliaries were employed at various times in the apprehension of Geronimo's small band. He and the group of people that were following him were tracked to a camp in the Sonora Mountains, and at a conference on September 3rd, 1886, at Skeleton Canyon in Arizona, Miles induced Geronimo to surrender once again, promising him that after an indefinite exile in Florida, he and his followers would be permitted to return to Arizona. The promise was not kept. Not surprisingly, we constantly see this in American history. Treaty after treaty made and then broken between the U.S. and natives. And the great majority of the time, it's broken on the U.S. side of the treaty. Let's see. Then they were moved to Fort Sill in Oklahoma, where he would farm and join the Dutch Reformed Church, which expelled him because of his inability to resist gambling. He never saw Arizona again, but by special permission of the War Department was allowed to sell photographs of himself and his handiwork at expositions. Wow. And before his death, he would dictate his autobiography to an S.S. Barrett, who would have it written out. So, excuse me. Okay, this must be further in the canyon where he was born. Turkey Creek, Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico, Mexico. So yeah, He would die and be buried in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Okay, the last two sources. Okay, it's because they were called Chiricahua by the Americans. This one, it says he was a part of the Indiandahe Apache instead of Chiricahua Apache. But right down here it says they were called Chiricahua by Americans. And Nedene. So, yeah. Geronimo joined with members of 3 other Central Apache bands, the Chihinde, the Sokaninde, which is the ones they called the Chiricahua. Okay. And then the Nedni. So yeah, war with Mexico, war with the U.S., and then fighting against a couple of neighboring tribes. Apache was just a collective term for several culturally related groups of natives that resided in the southwestern U.S., and the current division of Apache groups include the Western Apache, the Yavapai, the Coyotero, Arabapaya, or Aravaipa, Mojaves, Chiricahua, Tontos, Bailas, San Carlos, Mescalero, Jicarilla or Jicarilla, I'm not sure, Lipan, and Plains Apache, formerly known as the Kiowa Apache. People often just think of them as tribes, Apache. But it was more like they're related groups, but still separate. Like you would think of counties or states within a nation. So much bloodshed could have been spared if there had been discussions of an honest type with the native peoples. Massacre at Janos, March 5th, 1851. That's the one where they kill his family, isn't it? The trading town of Carrasco. Or in the town trading. Yeah, it's the one where they kill his wife, children, and mother. "400 Mexican soldiers, led by Colonel Jose Maria Carrasco." Fighting against the Mexicans. In his autobiography, Geronimo states, "I have killed many Mexicans. I do not know how many, for frequently I do not count them. Some of them are not worth counting. It has been a long time since then, but still, I have no love for the Mexicans. With me, they are always treacherous and malicious." So yeah, just looking through here. Let's see. The Indians always tried to live peaceably with the white soldiers and settlers. One day, during the time that the soldiers were stationed at Apache Pass, I made a treaty with the post. This was done by shaking hands and promising to be brothers. Cochise and Mangus, Colorado did likewise. I do not know the name of the officer in command, but this was the first regiment that ever came to Apache Pass. This treaty was made about a year before we were attacked in a tent, as above related. In a few days after the attack at Apache Pass, we organized in the mountains and returned to fight the soldiers. And then they have another piece here. General Cook said to me, "Why did you leave the reservation?" I said, "You told me that I might live in the reservation the same as white people lived. One year I raised a crop of corn and gathered and stored it, and the next year I put a crop of oats. And when that crop was almost ready to harvest, you told your soldiers to put me in prison, and if I resisted, to kill me. If I had been let alone, I would have been in good circumstances, but instead of that, you and the Mexicans are hunting me with soldiers." So even when he's put on the reservation, he's like, "Yeah, I would have been happy. I would have been left alone. Everything would have been fine. I was raising crops. I was trying to make a life for myself. And then, of course, no, that wasn't allowed. So, yeah. Let's see. Now, Geronimo constantly insisted in his memoirs and his autobiography that his people who surrendered had been misled, and that his surrender as a war prisoner in front of contested witnesses, especially General Stanley, was conditional. General Oliver O. Howard, chief of the U.S. Army Division of the Pacific, said on his part that Geronimo's surrender was accepted as that of a dangerous outlaw without condition. Howard's account was contested in front of the U.S. Senate. Prisoner of war. They were sent to prisoners at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. The Army held him there for about 6 weeks before he was sent to Fort Pickens in Pensacola, Florida. So, yeah. And then in 1888, they were relocated to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama. About 1/4 of the Apache population died of tuberculosis. But the Chiricahuas and Geronimo were eventually relocated to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Mm-mm-mm. So he had some celebrity status. The Omaha Exposition, the Pan American Exposition, and the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. Under Army Guard, he would dress in traditional clothing and pose for photographs and sell his crafts. In President Teddy Roosevelt's 1905 inaugural parade, Geronimo rode horseback down Pennsylvania Avenue with 5 Indian chiefs who wore full headgear and painted faces. Later that same week, Geronimo met with Roosevelt and made a request for the Chiricahuas at Fort Sill to be relieved of their status as prisoners of war and allowed to return to their homeland in Arizona. Through an interpreter, Roosevelt told Geronimo that he had a bad heart. You killed many of my people, you burned villages, and were not good Indians, good natives. Roosevelt responded that he would see how you and your people act on the reservation. You know, the native peoples in the Americas remind me of the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, because I know there were many city-states in ancient Greece. Athens, Sparta, Corinth. They all saw themselves as Greek, but they considered themselves autonomous as well. And they would never fully unite. So yeah. February 1909, thrown from his horse and lay in the cold all night until a friend would find him extremely ill and die of pneumonia on February 17th, 1909. Prisoner of the U.S. at Fort Sill. Slav, wife of Geronimo and child. I don't know. I guess that's second wife. Since the first wife and 3 kids were murdered. Married Chihashkish and had 2 children, Chapo and Don Say. Then he took another wife, Nana Bip, with whom he had 1 child. He later had a wife named Zia at the same time as another wife, Shiga. One named Dashashi and a later wife named Iteda. His ninth and last wife was Azul. Now, again, don't judge him having all these wives and children by the modern European American standards of, oh, one wife at a time. I'm sure there were some different rules in how they saw families and relationships. One of Geronimo's daughters, likely Donce, was married to Zabina Streeter. Streeter was well respected by Geronimo's band and referred to as White Apache. It was still shameful to acknowledge a relationship, as intermarriage with whites was considered dishonorable. The great grandson of Geronimo, Harlan Geronimo, taught Apache language lessons at the Mescalero Apache Reservation until his death in 2020. Huh. The alleged theft of Geronimo's skull Skull and Bones, the Yale Secret Society. Held the skull of Geronimo. Huh. So, in 2006, a 1918 letter from a Skull and Bones member, Winter Mead, written to F. Truby Davidson, claimed the theft. The skull of the worthy Geronimo the Terrible, exhumed from its tomb at Fort Sill by your club, is now safe inside the tomb and bone together with his well-worn femurs, bit, and saddle horn. The second term refers to the building of Yale's Skull and Bones Society, a revelation led Harlan Geronimo to write President George W. Bush, grandson of Prescott Bush, requesting his help in returning the remains. And remember, Prescott Bush was one of the original members of the Yale University Skull and Bones. According to our traditions, the remains of this sort, especially in this state, when the grave was desecrated, need to be reburied with the proper rituals to return the dignity and let his spirits rest in peace. Cameron University history professor David H. Miller notes that Geronimo's grave was unmarked at the supposed time his skull was taken. So his name becomes a part of military, inspired by the 1939 film Geronimo. U.S. Army paratroopers testing the practice of parachuting from planes began shouting, "Geronimo!" to show they had no fear of jumping out of the airplane. Other Native American-based traditions were also adopted in World War II, such as mohawk haircuts, face paint, and sporting spears on their unit patches. The Paratrooper Unit 1/509th PIR at Fort Johnson, Louisiana, uses Geronimo as their moniker. The U.S. military used the codename Geronimo for a raid that killed al-Qaeda terrorist Osama bin Laden in 2011, but its use outraged some Native Americans and was thus subsequently reported to be named or renamed Operation Neptune Spear. Harlan Geronimo, the great-great-grandson of Geronimo, said to the Senate Commission on Indian Affairs, "The use of Geronimo in the raid that killed bin Laden either was an outrageous insult or mistake, and it is clear from military records released that the name Geronimo was used at times by military personnel involved for both the military operation and for Osama bin Laden himself. 3 towns in the U.S. are named after Geronimo, one in Arizona, Oklahoma, and Texas. They also named a ship after him, the SS Geronimo. Song, a track named Geronimo, recorded by Les Elgert and his orchestra in 1953. The Shadows released a single called Geronimo in 1963, but it was a British instrumental rock group. 1972, Michael Martin Murphey had a song, Geronimo's Cadillac, inspired by a photo of Geronimo sitting in a luxury locomobile. A German duo, Modern Talking, released a different song with the same name, but with less explicit lyrical connection to Geronimo in 1986. And in 2014, the indie pop band Shepherd released Geronimo, which reached #1 on the Australian singles chart. So in Australia. Films. Geronimo has been featured in many Western movies. For example, the movie Stagecoach in 1939. 4 films actually titled Geronimo, where he is the title character. Geronimo itself, also a 1939 movie. There was another one titled Geronimo in 1962. And in 1993, 2 films about Geronimo were released within a few days of each other. Geronimo, an American Legend, about his surrender, and the biopic Geronimo. So yeah. The book How Few Remain, Geronimo forms an uneasy alliance with J.E.B. Stuart and the Confederate States, working against the U.S. and Mexico. He appeared in an episode of the radio show The Lone Ranger. TV series Stories of the Century. They have an episode named Geronimo. And there was an episode named Geronimo of the TV series Tombstone Territory. And Geronimo is in an episode of a show called Mr. Horn. Not the Geronimo himself, but he's played by an actor. There's one I know. Doctor Who, Matt Smith's Doctor, the 11th Doctor. Whenever he goes into a place, he shouts, Geronimo! Yeah. But yeah, that has been a look at Geronimo. We'll go ahead and end this long episode here. It's just crossed an hour. As always, educate thyself, Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing. Ask them to cite their sources. I'll be putting these links and sources in the description box below the video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.